Welcome to Global Connections on ThinkTech Hawaii. I'm your host, Jay Fidell. Today, we're going to talk about maritime security in the Western Pacific. What are its implications for US hegemony there? Our guest for the show is Carl Baker, Senior Advisor, Pacific Forum. Welcome to the show, Carl.
Always fun to talk about South China Sea and maritime security in Asia. It's somewhat of a moving target these days, I suppose, as the United States rethinks what's important in this world and what's important for its security and how much it contributes to public goods in that part of the world.
Yeah, the U.S. has to stay alert on maritime security issues in the Western Pacific. It has been traditionally alert in order to protect U.S. global trade interests. So we need to have a significant presence there. And you and I need to stay current on what is happening and likely to happen there. So what's the latest on maritime security in the Western Pacific? Is everything cool, or is it getting heated up in some way?
Yes, it's both. I mean, there is some pattern that's developing, I think, and that is that China has a huge presence, a Coast Guard presence in the South China Sea, and it has a growing military capability that really goes beyond the South China Sea, and it's what I think makes the Americans nervous, because it is a growing capability, but it certainly isn't a global capability. And so I think what's happening now is you have China feeling very comfortable that it can control what it considers its territory in the South China Sea inside the so-called 9- or 10- line that encompasses the entire space from all the way from Taiwan, very close to the Philippine border, all the way down to the northern territorial waters of Indonesia, and then up along the coast of Vietnam, back up to Hainan Island. And it literally says that China has control of that space, and that contradicts, of course, what the Americans and the rest of the world interpret as the United Nations law of the sea, conventional law of the sea. And so that's where the controversy really lies in terms of the South China Sea. But the bigger picture for the United States is it recognizes that China's military capability is growing significantly, and it's going beyond that 9- line, that space in the South China Sea, and China is increasingly moving forces past Taiwan, past the Philippines, and past Japan into the Western Pacific, or technically the Philippine Sea, which is on the Pacific Ocean side of the Philippines.
What do you mean moving forces? What kind of forces, and how threatening are they?
Well, naval and air forces. They're threatening only to the extent that military forces are threatening. They're not really threatening to the United States mainland, or even Hawaii for that matter, but they're threatening to Japan and the Philippines because they are moving through their territory. It's certainly threatening to Taiwan, probably more threatening to Taiwan, because that's a large focus of what those military forces are doing, is encircling Taiwan, showing the capability, blockading Taiwan. I think that's the part of the Chinese military that makes people in the region.
It's kind of an encirclement, isn't it? They're encircling Taiwan.
Well, they certainly have the capacity to encircle Taiwan with military forces. And, I think it's to be expected that is China's focus right now, is to ensure, in China's mind, to ensure that Taiwan doesn't become independent, that it doesn't declare its independence from China. And that's its main concern. And of course, the United States has a very ambiguous policy toward Taiwan. During the Biden administration, it was changed somewhat by Biden going somewhat off script by saying it would defend Taiwan. and there's a very nuanced sort of thing. We will defend Taiwan, but it has to be that it's a provocation by China. It's not because Taiwan declares independence. So that's always been wrapped up in this strategic ambiguity that was started during, well, really when Nixon and Kissinger decided to normalize relations with China, and that's been the American policy since then. But it's become more and more difficult to maintain that strategic ambiguity. And if you recall, during the Biden administration, there was a lot of talk about whether we should really do strategic clarity rather than ambiguity. And there's a debate in the community today that if there should be ambiguity or clarity on to the extent to which the United States will defend Taiwan. And so certainly Taiwan is wrapped up in all of this when we talk about maritime security, because it is a maritime problem for China, and also defending Taiwan's borders on the island obviously is a maritime problem for those trying to defend.
What is Trump's policy? Is he into defending Taiwan, or is he ambiguous also?
We really haven't seen anything very clear about what U.S. policy will be under Trump. That's sort of an oxymoron, I suppose. But to the extent that they've said anything, they've said Taiwan is important. But of course, as you know, Taiwan is also the manufacturer of semiconductor chips. And what Trump has said is that they really owe us, and they should be paying for our protection. The typical rhetoric that you get out of Trump himself. As far as the Defense Department is concerned, we haven't really seen anything more than we will defend Taiwan from an attack by China. The standard sort of language that you see come out in any new administration. But there certainly isn't much clarity yet on how the Trump administration will react to some sort of provocation or some sort of incident in or around Taiwan.
Yeah, he seems to be focusing these days, spending his time on domestic, disassembly of the government, and on Middle East, and on most recently on Ukraine. But I haven't seen anything where he's said something or done something about maritime security in the South China Sea. Am I missing something?
No, I don't think so. That's what I'm saying. Is I don't think that they have really said very much about Indo-Pacific. During the campaign, there was talk about, now we're finally going to get to the United States focusing on in the Indo-Pacific and on Asia, because China is the big threat. But again, we really haven't seen anything. What we have seen is that the tariffs that were going to be put in place on day one haven't been, and the 10% tariffs are about to be put in place. And China, of course, has responded by saying, "Oh, we can do that. We'll up your ante a little bit and say we're going to do tariffs on you too." So China is the first one. Prior to this, in the Western Hemisphere, everybody has pretty much buckled under and said, "Yeah, okay, we'll bring forces to the border and we'll satisfy your desire for recognition and attention, and placate you so you don't put 25% tariffs on." But I think in China's case, there is the 10%, and the iron and steel are coming next, and and it looks like everybody is involved in that round of tariffs, and so that's going to change the dynamic a little bit. But again, as far as what's happening in the South China Sea and Taiwan, the administration has been pretty solid.
You mentioned that Trump feels that Taiwan owes us something. And my reaction to that, and I wonder how you feel about it, is that's really not the right statement of the relationship, because they do have the semiconductor industry. We are dependent on Taiwanese semiconductors. If Taiwan sold them somewhere else, or made other arrangements, or made some kind of countermeasure, it would be the United States that would suffer more than Taiwan, or at least the United States would suffer profoundly for the lack of the chips, right?
Mhm. Oh, sure, yeah, and don't forget, TSMC has just opened their plant in Phoenix, so so they are investing in the United States. They've put a lot of money into that. Remember during the first Trump administration, Foxconn, one of the basic manufacturers of chip material, was supposed to open a big plant in Wisconsin, which never really quite happened. There's something there. It certainly wasn't I forget the number, 10 billion or something that they were going to invest there. It was scaled down significantly, partly because they couldn't find the labor to actually support it, and there were too many administrative and regulatory problems associated with actually putting it up. So Taiwan has tried certainly to accommodate U.S. interests in investing in the United States in developing a strong economic relationship with the United States. So no, I don't think it's very fair to make that sort of assertion. But I mean, this is classic Trump, is that everybody owes us something because we are America.
Yeah. Well, I worried about Taiwan. I think we need Taiwan in many ways. Now, you mentioned that China is going to the nine-dash line. It's going east. It's preserving, maybe I should say, hegemony on an Eastern movement basis, and it's covering more ground. What's the trend? What is the current status of it? What is the dynamic of that move?
I mean, that's very American of you to say that the Chinese are moving east and that they're challenging. And then the next part of that assertion is that they're challenging the American military and all that. And I think I think we step back a little bit and look at it from China's perspective, because what China sees itself doing is protecting itself from the United States and asserting its right to what it claims its territory is in the South China Sea. That's why I say the skirmishes that go on around Taiwan and forays into the Pacific Ocean beyond the so-called First Island chain is really about Taiwan. But I think that when you look at what's happening in the South China Sea, China sees this as area access, area denial. And what they're talking about there is that they see the United States as a threat to China. And if you allow the US military to gather forces in that semi-enclosed sea called the South China Sea, China is very vulnerable to American military capabilities. So what it's done is it's tried to deny access to the South China Sea by the United States military. And much of what it's done in the South China Sea and in the context of the nine-dash line is build a military capability that prevents freedom of access by the U.S. military. Now, the Chinese are quick to say, we're not talking about freedom of navigation of maritime shipping because we need maritime shipping. The Chinese need ships to flow through the South China Sea just as much as Japan and Korea do. So they're not talking about denying access to that space by commercial ships. What they find reprehensible by the United States is what they're doing with their military ships in that region, because the United States sees the South China Sea as having the same rights as the high seas under UNCLOS. And we can get burrowed down in the legal nuances of UNCLOS. But the fact is that the United States uses military vessels, military ships, military airplanes to assert its right to freedom of the high seas over economic exclusive zones. And the Chinese are saying, no, we shouldn't be doing this. You should tell us when you're flying military aircraft and running military ships through economic exclusive zones. And so that's the difference between the United States and China when it comes to what's happening in the South China Sea in the context of the nine-dash line. So, and the Americans are simply saying, no, we need to ensure freedom of access. We need to ensure that we have right of innocent passage by military ships in territorial waters and freedom of the high seas over economic exclusive zones. And that doesn't include those artificial islands that China created in the middle of the South China Sea.
what are we doing exactly? How are we responding to their claim that any entry is a violation of some rights of theirs? How active are we in terms of entering that space?
Well, we routinely run ships on freedom of navigation operations to assert our right to move within 500 meters of those land features that China has built. And of course, when they do that, China responds with threats of move away from our exclusive zones and all that. And we've also convinced the Australians and the Japanese and the British and the French and the Germans to also run ships through those waters, the militaries from those countries through those waters to assert the right of freedom of high seas in those areas. So that's what we've done as far as that's concerned. But then the United States also, because it's a treaty ally of the Philippines, has also taken up sides with the Philippines in the Philippines contestation between China and the Philippines. And there it gets a little stickier because that is where the United States has been very careful to avoid a situation where they get caught up in conflict between the Philippines and China. And so they've been working very hard at improving Philippine Coast Guard capabilities, as has Japan. Actually, Japan has probably done more in the way of building Coast Guard capacity in the Philippines specifically than the United States has. But the United States has also, made several statements now saying that an attack on a Philippine vessel would call into effect the military defense agreement between the United States and the Philippines, which says that if there is an attack on one, there will be consultations with the other. There isn't an automatic response like there is in NATO. The difference between the NATO agreement, Article 5, says that you will respond to an aggression, where the U.S. Philippine military mutual defense agreement says that you will do consultations.
How are our relations with those countries, that we have persuaded to bring their military vessels, our allies bring their military vessels into this area? How are relations doing? Because it strikes me that, you say we have persuaded them to do that and they are doing that and we are allies. But we have an isolationist administration who doesn't mind making enemies of our friends and our allies. I wonder how strong that relationship is and how persuasive we are.
Yeah, well, I think we're probably going to find out sometime in the next couple of years how strong it is. Under the difference between what I saw, what the Biden administration was trying to do, and what the Trump administration appears to be doing, is that the Biden administration saw China as a threat, and it tried to gain allies and partners to address that threat. Trump, on the other hand, doesn't has it's not clear that the Trump administration sees China as a threat. I think it does. The Republicans in general have said that China is a threat and that it sees China as the primary concern as far as threat is concerned. What Trump has not done is admitted or accepted the idea that you actually need partners to be able to counter the China threat. So at this point, I think that the Trump administration appears prepared to address the threat unilaterally rather than multilaterally, as the Biden administration did.
Yeah, in Europe, we have European countries that are working together for trade, for defense, in various ways, to the exclusion of the United States, because they say they don't want the Trump administration helping them, because it doesn't, and they don't want to rely on it. And I find that interesting, and I also find it interesting that some of these countries in Southeast Asia and the like, in Asia generally, are rearming now, with or without the help of the United States. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, there's been a rearming certainly in Southeast Asia that all the countries have done some activity to rearm. Um, I'm not so sure that it's really focused on a particular threat as much as it is a little bit of vanity, a little bit of self assurance that well, since my neighbor has airplanes, I need airplanes, and since my neighbor has submarines, I need submarines. There isn't. I don't think there's really a solid agreement on why they're building up their defense capabilities. Other than that, they see the United States as less reliable and less likely to be able to counter China in some sort of conflict in Southeast Asia. But I think it's more interesting to see what these Southeast Asia countries are doing in terms of their economic relations, because they're very much hedging against the American demands for trade balances and for tariffs on goods that are being produced. And at the same time, they see China as their main market. So, with the exception of the Philippines, I think all the Southeast Asia countries are being very careful to maintain a strong economic relationship with China through various multilateral economic agreements, which China is part of and the United States is not. The Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is an ASEAN, Southeast Asia-based agreement. China is part of it, Japan is part of it, Korea is part of it, Australia is part of it, as is the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, which China is trying to become a partner with the other countries that originally were partnering with the United States until the first Trump administration withdrew. And so, I see what's happening in Southeast Asia more interesting than the defense buildup, because the defense buildup is somewhat, to me, somewhat incoherent. The economic buildup is very much focused on maintaining a partnership with China and maintaining multilateral relations. And one of the arguments that I've made is that Japan and Australia, in many ways, are leading this multilateral effort to maintain a multilateral mechanism for trade, and the United States is at risk of being left out. And the partnership will include China. And once that happens, it will be very difficult for the United States to maintain any kind of meaningful economic relationship in Southeast Asia.
Well, that takes me to a question I wanted to ask you, and that is, so we have, Trump using tariffs everywhere, or many places,
Or threatening
as his
to.
primary, or threatening them, his primary threat and negotiating tool, if you want. What is he doing with the countries of Asia? I mean, we know he's raised the tariff on China, and China has raised the tariff on the U.S. But what about the other countries? Is he also, doing tariffs on Taiwan, on Korea, on Japan, on Australia, New Zealand, and so forth? Or is that quiet?
Well, I mean, the iron and steel, Japan is a big producer of iron and steel. So we're going to find out what happens when that comes into place. And obviously, Prime Minister Ishida was in Washington last week saying, hey, we'll invest a lot of money in the United States. Just don't hurt us. And so certainly the Japanese manufacturers are worried. The government is worried. Uh, but beyond Japan, South Korea is in somewhat of the same boat, although South Korea has always maintained a stronger relationship with China than Japan has. I think so. I think that South Korea is probably going to go through the same thing. They still produce a lot of steel. They still produce, a lot of ships that take a lot of steel. So I think they're concerned. Certainly Vietnam, with its Vietnam and Thailand, for that matter, with its big trade imbalance with the United States, is worried about what Trump is going to do with tariffs. And again, how much of it is threat, how much of it is real? Because if it is real, if they do implement it, it's going to push those countries toward China as an alternative.
Yeah, one of the things I found very interesting was the Philippines is rearming itself or arming itself. I don't know if it was armed before. It's trying to buy fighter jets from Korea, who apparently Korea makes fighter jets, trying to buy submarines, and trying to buy missiles, supersonic missiles. And they have a lot of angst about China because China keeps on, attacking them in the South China Sea. And they can't rest for a moment with China's provocations. But so they want these missiles. So where do they get these missiles? And this is so interesting, Carl. They get these missiles from India.
They have missiles. They have the Typhoon missile from the United States as well. What happened, in fact, last year is the United States in a military exercise brought Typhoon missiles to the Philippines, and they left them there. So we have it. They do actually have U.S. missiles also, which very much irritated the Chinese that we left those Typhoon missiles. So yeah, the Brahmos have been that was done a couple of years ago, and they're seen as really defense of their land claims in the South China Sea. The Typhoon missiles are really anti-ship, and they present a bigger threat to China actually than even the Brahmos.
It also strikes me that this goes perhaps beyond strictly maritime. I remember, well, I remember a year ago or so, maybe less. You and I talked about it, about Russian planes, Russian aircraft, Russian military aircraft flying precariously close to Japan, even over the territorial waters or land of Japan.
Mhm.
What's that about? Is that in some kind of coordinated effort with China? Why is Russia doing that? How is that part of maritime security, if at all, for the South China Sea?
Not so much for the South China Sea. The Russians are in Southeast Asia, but not in a big way. Malaysia and Indonesia uh, and Vietnam still have Russian military equipment. It's not very reliable, and so they're looking to move away from it. The Indonesians are buying U.S. aircraft now. The Malaysians are buying. I want to say the Malaysians are buying those F-A-50s from Korea, like Philippines do. And so the Russians really aren't in Southeast Asia as much as they are in in Northeast Asia, in Japan. And China and Russia have done big maritime military exercises in that part of the world. They've done some joint patrols in South China Sea, but certainly not to the extent that they have done up in the Yellow Sea or up in the Sea of Hormuz, up in the Northeast Asia region.
Just a day or two ago, we had a Chinese plane flying very close and dropping flares near an Australian surveillance plane, either in the South China Sea or close to Australia. What does that mean? Why is that happening, and what is the significance of that engagement?
Well, that's part of China's way of addressing the fact that Australia is running ships and flying aircraft in the South China Sea. They see that as an Australian provocation in what is rightly historically China's. And again, this is the big conflict over China's claim to historic rights to the South China Sea. That's very much a revisionist history of how China has interacted in the Spratlys. But China's historical narrative today says that you have the four, what they call the four Shahs. Shah in Chinese is island. So you have the Dongsha East Islands, the Nansha, which are the Spratlys, and then the Dongsha is the east, and the Nansha is the south, and then you have the Shisha, which is the Paracels, which is off the Vietnam coast and which is contested by Vietnam. So you have the four Shahs that are China's claim to territory, and they do the aggregate of those islands, and so then you end up with the land features that aren't contiguous at all, and half of them aren't really islands at all, and they call that their basis for saying that they have historic rights to those regions. But again, it's a revisionist history that only came up as China was trying to rationalize why it should control access to and resources in the South China Sea.
One other thing that I wanted to ask you about is Fiji and the Solomon Islands, which have been historically close to the U.S. From the time of the war, anyway. Um, the Chinese have a substantial population there. They have a business community there. They have a presence there. They have investments there. I don't think we, the United States, has anywhere near the presence that China has in these territories, which are really American. And that seems to me to be part of this larger picture of maritime security because it's so close. Your thoughts about what's going on in Fiji, the Solomon Islands?
Well, it's more generally the Pacific Ocean. I mean, they have been in a contest with Taiwan over diplomatic relations in the Pacific Islands, and I mean these islands really don't have much of an economy beyond their ocean economy, which is significant because unlike the South China Sea, islands in the Pacific are real places, and they have huge economic zones that are full of fish and full of resources. And so the Chinese, I think, are very interested in expanding their capacity to fish in those waters and ultimately extract other resources out of those areas. And so yeah, they've been working very hard to build by relations with these countries in the Pacific Ocean. And these countries don't have a lot of money, and so that's why they're quite susceptible to China's approach to building relations is swamp them with economic investment, build a nice big stadium and call it by the name of the current prime minister, and it does a lot of good for building goodwill with the governments of those small countries.
So the Belt Road moves east as well as west.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, yeah. I mean, it's good. They call it. I think it's called the Maritime Belt Road or something.
Was that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, there's a name for it. But yeah, I mean, I think it. Sure, China is, and clearly the United States got caught flat-footed, and Australia got caught flat-footed. I mean, traditionally, you say that these countries were close to the United States, but traditionally, the United States was somewhat deferential to Australia as the real partner for these countries. And so, so both Australia and the United States, I think, got caught flat-footed in China's somewhat aggressive approach to building relations with those countries. It's part of China's desire to expand its influence in that part of the world, for sure.
Why? Does China need to do all this stuff? Or can China just sit back and relax and do its economy instead? Why does it have to have this kind of power?
I'm not so sure that it's power as much as it is access to resources. I mean, I think China is ultimately interested in resource exploitation. It's not looking, unlike some people. I don't believe that China is building stepping stones to Hawaii. I don't think China is interested in global domination. I think the United States wants to portray China that way because it's to their advantage to portray them as a global threat. But I think China is perfectly willing to exert its influence over areas that matter to China most. And right now, that is Africa and Asia.
I keep thinking of Simon Winchester in his book called, I think it was called Pacific. He was at the East West Center several years ago, and he wrote a book that had various chapters about various countries and episodes around the Pacific. And one of the things he said that stuck for me was, the U.S. has to recognize that it really can't be as powerful as it used to be in the Pacific. And, it's the same thing that Richard Wolff, who teaches economics at, I think, MIT, Amherst, Yale, one of those. He says, the U.S. is on a decline. You got to live with that. That's the way it is. And it's been on decline for a while. And so when you take, the economic side of things plus the Pacific hegemony side of things, you say, the U.S. doesn't really have the same kind of clout. It can do rhetoric, it can make deals, make defense agreements and all that, but it doesn't have the same kind of clout. And where Obama pivoted to Asia, which was memorable and admirable, I don't think we're pivoting to Asia now. We're not pivoting as much as he said we were going to pivot. I think he gave that up. So the question I put to you is, do we need another pivot, or should we just relax?
My suggestion is we should just relax and think about how to maintain an economic relationship in Asia. I think that would go a lot further than trying to maintain a huge security presence and focus on the military aspect of it. And and there, and again, the Trump administration has been completely silent. But what is going to happen to this Indo-Pacific economic framework that comes out of the Biden administration? What is Trump going to do with it? I can't imagine that he's going to continue to call it the Indo-Pacific economic framework because it's something that Biden did. And so, but I haven't seen anything in terms of talking about economic relations in Asia, or for that matter, the world, other than tariffs. And tariffs is not an answer when it comes to economic engagement with this part of the world. I think you're right. I think the United States is declining in its capacity to influence Asia, and the pivot or the rebalance or whatever word we want to call it this year, is ultimately has to involve a recognition that China and Southeast Asia are an economic engine that is driving Asia for sure. And to the extent that the Americans can tap into that is to their advantage. To try to isolate itself from that economic engine puts you in the caboose.
It seems to me that Taiwan is somehow center of all of that. You mentioned earlier, and I wanted to get one more, comment from you about it, is that if Taiwan declared independence, I think you said, that would be a problem. Is it that Taiwan has not declared independence, or could or would, or that China would react by force? What is that? What's the significance of that?
Well, that would sever China's claim to Taiwan, and that would force, I think, China into taking very serious consideration of a military takeover, military attack on Taiwan to assert its claim on Taiwan. To this point, Taiwan has been very careful not to do that in the United States. As I said, it's been very careful to not support that. And we saw that as recent as a couple of months ago, that the United States clarified its policy one more time. And I seem to recall that there was a Trump campaign statement that made the same thing, that we do not support an independent Taiwan. Now, I mean, because I think that is something that would trigger military conflict if Taiwan would declare independence. But understand, Taiwan still has strong economic relations with China. I mean, it's still selling its chips to China. TSMC has not forgotten China. Foxconn is still building things in China. Granted, they're trying to diversify just like everybody else, but they still have a huge presence in China. There's millions of Taiwanese working in China today. So it's not like there's a big wall between those two places. And there's people in Taiwan that still think there's a prospect for some sort of peaceful resolution between Taiwan and China. And unfortunately, nobody really talks about it anymore because China has confused the one China principle with its policy, and the principle has become policy. And so it's very difficult to talk about what kind of relationship you could establish that would be short of a PRC dominated Taiwan, where back in the old halcyon days of the 80s and 90s, there was actually talk about how you could have a two-state solution in Taiwan and China and still honor the one China principle, where you have a Chinese cultural influence that is represented by two separate governments. But that's gone today, partly because there's been a push by the DPP in Taiwan toward independence, and there's been a push toward PRC domination in Beijing, making it very difficult to have those kinds of conversations. So today, it's becoming closer and closer to China is going to have to demand subservience by Taiwan, or Taiwan is going to declare independence, which will force China into either taking military action or acquiescing that it will never have Taiwan as part of its sovereign territory.
This is as complex as any area on the planet. Well, thank you, Carl, for helping us understand, the nature of maritime security in the South China Sea and all these countries around it, and America's role in all of that. I'm your host, Jay Fidell. This is Global Connections. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time. Aloha.